In late 1980s and early 1990s, the Kenyan public was treated to collapse of banks. Who was behind this public rape? This is the true story of Hezi Bezalel, a real murderer and the most corrupt individual Israel has ever nurtured. Bezalel was born in Basra, Iraq, and moved with his family to Israel when he was 5 years old. The family settled in the Or Yehuda absorption camp, and later on moved to Ramat Gan. During his military service, he served as a tank commander in the Yom Kippur War. He later began his economic studies at the Tel Aviv University. Following the completion of his MA in economics, he began teaching at the Tel Aviv University as well as the Ben Gurion University in Be'er Sheva. He worked as Professor Chaim Ben Shach's teaching assistant and initiated his PhD studies in London. He moved from Israel to Kenya in 1984 and teamed up with Nicholas Biwott, the total man as he was popularly known, who was married to an Israeli national. With IHS subtle and crafty character, Hezi was able to convince the then Minister for Energy and Regional Development to establish an investment bank in Nairobi called Trade Bank. Trade Bank hit the road running and became the bank of choice. Government institutions and public was cheated into parting with their well-earned. Hezi, being the mastermind, was able to open many other companies with late Biwott. They siphoned money to other companies that they owned and later sold to Al Noor Qasim when it was on its deathbed, according to report named Kroll on Biwott, Trade Bank and Export Financing. The Kenya Kroll report alleged that Nicholas Biwott, according to Source A, Al Noor Qasim, was involved with exporting financing fraud to a quantum of about 700 million through Trade Bank. Did Kroll get it right? Biwott's lawyer said, "A commission of inquiry into the Goldenberg scandal investigated this allegation and found conclusively that Nicholas Biwott and his companies had not been involved in export financing." The source investigates. It is clear from the Bossire report into the Goldenberg scandal that Trade Bank was heavily implicated in the export financing fraud. The timings of Trade Bank's fraudulent activities in this regard are important in relation to any implication that Biwott was involved. Kenya's pre-exporting finance scheme was introduced in December 1990 and terminated in March 1993. The available evidence indicates that this was after Al Noor Qasim, Kroll's Source A, assumed control and management of the bank. The Kenya Kroll report does not name Biwott as a party to the export financing fraud. The source is uncertain as to whether Kroll was trying to implicate him in this regard, or merely repeated Qasim's allegations without checking their veracity or the reliability of the source. Had they done so, they would have discovered that Source A, Qasim, was found by the High Court of Kenya, a decision upheld by the Appeal Court, to have fraudulently transferred the ownership of the Yahya Center from Nicholas Biwott to support a massive loan to build the Trade Bank Center, fraudulently transferred money that resulted in the collapse of Trade Bank, and was wanted by Interpol for questioning. There was, however, a suggestion in the East African Standard, reporting on the Goldenberg inquiry, on the 7th of May 2004, that Biwott's HZ group of companies were connected to a number of companies which Trade Bank used to obtain pre-shipment finance for fictitious exports. The companies in question were identified as Gawi Freighter Limited, Air Maritime and Wilgo Agencies Limited. The East African Standard, however, does not give the basis upon which the companies were linked to Biwott. Nor is it apparent from the reproduced transcripts of evidence, since Biwott was not one of those named as a shareholder or director of any of the three companies. According to the transcripts of evidence at the Goldenberg inquiry, former CBK Deputy Governor Eliphaz Riungu gave evidence on the 21st of April 2004 that the directors and shareholder of Gawi Freighter and Wilgo Agencies were P.K. Langat, P.A. Yego, Wilfred Yego, Samuel Yego, A.K. Abdi and Bezalel Hezi. Riungu confirmed that he did not have any personal knowledge that the companies were related to Biwott. Basically, Hezi was the kleptomania in the late Biwott's empire, and by the time they fell out with while at Trade Bank, he groomed a bunch of cronies and straighted another bank called Eurobank, which included his long-term lawyer Mr. Firdosh Jamal, Solomon Muthamia, Zachary Kamondo and former Kenya Revenue Authority boss John Munge. Bezalel was the main financier and his goal was to steal money from the government agencies and parastatals. With the help of late Biwott, he was able to recruit most government agencies. Uganda. Once he milked Kenya dry, Hezi Bezalel moved to Uganda. By then he was fully loaded with money and he set up Nile Bank Limited. As an investor, he was able to bring President Museveni close to him through President's brother Salah. His number one priority was to trade in arms throughout Africa. With the help of Saleh, he was to get business with Uganda government, but ended up conning the government billions of money. In a study entitled Documenting Corruption in the Arms Trade, it paints Hezi as a devil in the making who never cares about anyone else except his own interests. His activities in Uganda brought this small East African country to its knees. Corruption Tracker, documenting corruption in the arms trade. Due to continued Sudanese bombing in the northern territories of Uganda in the late 1990s, the Ugandan government decided to acquire jet fighters to carry out border patrols and to force down Sudanese bombers. They also bought anti-aircraft guns and a number of tanks. Politicians saw this continued instability as an opportunity for further military procurement, along with kickbacks and other forms of self-enrichment. The Uganda People's Defence Force, UPDF, had ceased to be a force for the protection of Uganda, but instead for the protection of a small elite. The National Resistance Movement, NRM, government and the UPDF have become a springboard for private profiteering. Yoweri Museveni, president of Uganda since 1986, directed the MOD to seek the procurement of military equipment. Major General Caleb Akwandanaho, aka Salim Saleh, half-brother of President Museveni, special advisor on military and political affairs, in charge of arms procurement for the UPDF. Hezi Bezalel, former Mossad officer turned arms dealer, based in Kampala, had an agreement with Saleh to buy used military equipment to sell for profit to Uganda. Ziv Shef, Israeli businessman and arms dealer, headed the consortium which included Bezalel and Saleh. Amos Golan, retired Israeli army colonel and former Mossad officer turned arms dealer, involved in the maintenance of the already purchased and faulty planes. Summary of corruption allegations. Due to the absence of standard guidelines for defense procurement in the Ugandan Ministry of Defense, MOD, the acquisition of weaponry for the UPDF often results in the purchase of obsolete items. Guns. Uganda bought second-hand 100 million anti-aircraft guns through a consortium who got them from North Korea. When they arrived, they were completely obsolete. Tanks. The 62 T-55 tanks were bought for $28 million, $450,000 each, and are said to have come from Bulgaria and Romania. The tanks were heavily overvalued. The Bulgarian Defense Ministry sells outdated T-55 tanks, produced in the early 1960s, at about $30,000. The price for one coming with spare parts is about $50,000. In early 1998, Israeli intermediaries and senior government officials reportedly received $4 million in commission payments to solidify the deal, although it is unclear who the recipients were. Planes. The 4 MiG-21 jet fighters from Belarus cost a total of $50 million. The planes were said to be grossly overvalued. A more reasonable price was estimated to be $10 million, so $40 million was wasted in inflated prices. No tendering or bidding process took place for the planes. Top leaders were using their virtually unfettered discretionary authority to manipulate tenders for private gains. President Museveni had directed the MOD to buy anti-aircraft guns for the purpose of shooting down Sudanese planes. This consortium was headed by Shef, working for Bezalel and Saleh. Bezalel had solidified business ties with Saleh, who together were buying used Israeli military equipment to sell for great profits to Uganda. The consortium bought these guns from North Korea. They were bought without refurbishments and with multiple mechanical defects. From December 1997 to January 1998, these guns were taken to the northern territories of Uganda to be used against the Sudanese Antonov bombers. They failed in this mission, proving to be junk. 1998 December. The UPDF then took delivery of a consignment of 62 Russian-made T-55 tanks from Bulgaria and Romania which were to be used to intervene against Sudan. During an inspection of the tanks in Eastern Europe, a mechanical engineer sent by the MOD reportedly refused to issue a certificate of worthiness. Upon arrival in Uganda, the tanks turned out to be obsolete, all but 8 of which were unfit for operation. In order to make the tanks serviceable, they had to be reconditioned at great expense by 4 Israeli mechanics. The Ugandan MOD contacted intermediary Bezalel, who was working closely with Saleh to purchase 4 MiG-21 fighter jets for the UPDF. The fighter jets that were eventually supplied were outdated Soviet-made planes with limited bomb carriage capacity and malfunctioned radar guidance systems. Their fuel tanks were also too small for purposes of flying from Gulu Air Base to as far as Juba in southern Sudan and returning to base without refueling. Moreover, 2 of the jets delivered to Entebbe military base had only one wing. 1999 November, the government contracted Golan, another Israeli businessman, to take the warplanes to Israel's state-owned Israel Aircraft Industries, EI Enterprises, for upgrading and remodeling. The jet fighters that the Ugandan government eventually acquired were therefore considerably more expensive than if they had purchased new directly from the manufacturers. Investigation outcomes. Guns. In early 1998, the government intended to sue the consortium led by Israeli intermediary Chef for supplying faulty anti-aircraft guns. The agreement was held to be an informal understanding between the two parties, therefore not actionable in court. Tanks. No legal proceedings were brought forward for the tanks either, as they were somewhat serviceable after renovation. Planes. As for the supply of inappropriate planes, a deal led by Israeli intermediary Bezalel, the agreement that was signed was deemed too vague and informal to be actionable in court. Sala was implicated in a number of political financing scandals before stepping down from his post as senior advisor to the president on defense and security. He was forgiven by his brother President Museveni and was publicly exonerated for his crimes. The president implied that because Sala was an experienced cadre whose services were still required, his brother's conflict of interest was to be overlooked. Museveni, however, declared Hezi Bazalel persona non grata and can never set his foot on Ugandan soil. This is the reason why he sold his Nile Bank Limited to Barclays Bank Limited. Rwanda. In 2015, Hezi Bezalel was the dominant Israeli figure in Rwanda, according to Israeli military affairs journalist, Lieberman. Bezalel began his career in Uganda, where he befriended Paul Kagame, the Rwandan Tutsi refugee who headed the Rwanda Patriotic Front, RPF, that overthrew the Hutu government, with arms supplied by Bezalel, during the course of the Rwanda killing fields of 1994. Starting in 1992, Israel provided training and arms to the Hutu-dominated army and continued to do so during the killing sprees during the 1994 war. 11. By 2015, Bezalel was Rwanda's honorary consul in Israel. Bezalel was also reported to be behind the deal to deport African asylum seekers in Israel, mainly from Sudan and Eritrea, to Rwanda and Uganda, the latter agreeing to take these in return for arms. Kagame is a controversial figure in the recent history of Rwanda. Praised by the US, United Kingdom and Israel for ending the genocide of Tutsis in 1994, his RPF has also been identified as implicated in many, if not most, of the horrific killings, 12, that engulfed this troubled country at the time. Since the ascension of Kagame and the RPF to political power, there have been substantive indications of ongoing repression of political opposition in the country, extending to assassinations and attacks outside, including the killing of many Hutus who had fled in the aftermath of the RPF victory, to the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. In 2015, HRW reported impressive progress in economic and social development indicators, but that the Rwandan government severely restricted freedom of expression and association, did not tolerate dissent, and limited political space, the media and independence of civil society. Real or suspected opponents inside and outside the country continued to be targeted. 1. Patrick Kareyeger, a former head of Rwanda's intelligence services, was found murdered in a Johannesburg hotel. Detainees were held unlawfully for several weeks or months in police or military custody in unrecognized detention centers. Dozens of people were reported disappeared. Some reappeared in prison after prolonged incommunicado detention, but others remained unaccounted for. Borgen reported in 2016 authoritarian streaks, like the forced removal of undesirables into detention centers, burning of farmers' fields because they did not grow their assigned crops, and the stripping of villages' grass roofs as part of modernization. Since 1996, Rwanda had an average annual GDP growth rate of 7% and an increasingly diverse economy. Sectors, such as agriculture, services, electricity, infrastructure, construction and tourism sectors, the latter contributed 10% of the GDP. Nevertheless, around 38% of the population lived below the poverty line, resulting from a poor education. 68% of first graders ended up completing primary education, low domestic savings, and little rural disposable time and income. Kenya. Hezi Bazalel has activated his links in Kenya again. For close to 30 years he has not done business in Kenya using his names because he fell out with the late Nicholas Kipyetor Kiprono Arap Biwott, after he blocked the sewerage system in Yaya Center Block B because he was denied major shareholding in the mall. Also, he had fallen out with the late John Munge because John felt that Hezi used them as directors in Eurobank to swindle the Kenyan public for his own personal interest. Hezi feared the two, since his money from all African countries is wired to Kenyan banks. He operates a mafia-like cartel where he is not registered as director or shareholder, but the companies are registered by his concubines, girlfriends and associates. Now Hezi is back in Kenya with the Kenya Kwanza administration. Our whistleblower informs us that Hezi is now in control of Parliament, DCI and the armed forces. In our next episode we shall be able to put into focus the contracts the Ruto administration has awarded this criminal who wants to swindle the public for the second time. The big question is, will the lightning strike twice? Does the president know who he is dealing with? Do his advisors do background tests for individuals before they give contracts? We shall also focus on how he is arming M23 in DRC, Ivory Coast, South Sudan and time allowing we look at his role in Liberian's conflict. Produced by We the Whistleblowers Africa.